Okay, this is actually the last video I'm going to do for this whole topic. Um, so I hope you've found them useful. It's taken me quite a long time, hours and hours and hours, but hopefully it'll be worth it for you guys. So we're gonna. This is the last one we're going to do. So again, just going to do about knowledge, and the focus for this unit is about life in Nazi Germany. So women. So the Nazis had a very old-fashioned understanding about what they thought was the ideal woman, and women were there to be mothers. Women were there to be, to wear traditional clothes, not drinking, and to believe in this Nazi idea of Kinderkirchen. Can I say that Kinderkirchen Kirch, which is children, kitchen, church? They should stay at home. They should be fair-haired and blue-eyed and Aryan. So they had all these kind of like really old-fashioned ideas about women. So first of all, the number one policy: women should not work. Okay, and actually that was successful because the number of employed married women fell. Number two, women should get married, and they actually encouraged and gave loans because obviously weddings got expensive, etc. And the number of marriages did increase. There was a kind of ulterior motive to do that, which was basically women should have more children. So it was stipulated that women should have 4 children, and that didn't quite occur, but the birth rate did increase. And obviously the long-term thinking there was, 20, 30 years, we're going to have a whole family of Nazis, like our perfect photo there, a boy and then the Hitler Youth, etc. Women are also encouraged to join something called the German Women's Enterprise, and they gave women medals for having children, and they ran programs about how to be the perfect wife and cooking and all that kind of stuff. And that was actually incredibly popular, and they had over 6 million members that actually joined that movement. So they're very old-fashioned, but quite an interesting, good example of how the Nazis were successful in kind of controlling people. Okay, young people. So the aims of this was obviously they understood this, um, that basically they wanted young people to support the Nazi Party. In fact, most of the people who were defending Hitler in the last days, in Berlin when the Russians were attacking, were, young kids, 13, 14, 15. These were the guys who weren't surrendering to the Russians. So they'd been brainwashed by the Hitler Youth. They wanted young people to be proud to be German, girls to be strong and healthy, to be wives and mothers, and boys to work and fight for the Nazi Party. So there's 4 different groups. So something called the Young German Folk for young boys, young girls for girls. Don't type that into Google. Hitler Youth, infamously for the boys. Hiking, sort of military training, really. And the League of German Maidens was, cooking and kind of making this ideal um, woman. A big area that the Nazis focused on, obviously, clearly, was education. So generally, people went to school to about the age of 14, and after 14, they'd kind of some of the brightest students would go on to some kind of like Nazi special schools. Schools were separated for boys and girls because the curriculum was very different for boys and girls. So PE, physical education, being strong and healthy, was very important. History was really important. The history of Germany, Prussia, beating the French in the Franco-Prussian War, and all those kind of German successes were highlighted. They also introduced new subjects like race studies. Okay, the dominance of the Aryan race, and a new thing called eugenics, which is basically kind of loosely based on the ideas of Darwinism and the superiority of the German Aryan race. All teachers had to be Nazi members, and if you weren't, you were sacked. Textbooks were rewritten, even maths textbooks were rewritten, to kind of like brainwash kids. There were flags in the classroom, and every lesson kids had to stand up and kind of give the Hitler salute. So really, education was totally transformed under the Nazis. Okay, the economy. So the big area, obviously, one of the main reasons why why people began to vote for Hitler was because of the ridiculous unemployment levels after the Wall Street crash. So first of all, they introduced something called the National Labour Service, the RAD, and this made it compulsory for men 18 to 25 to work for 6 months in very hard manual labour. It wasn't particularly popular, very boring, very low pay. But what it did do was it reduced unemployment. They also spent a huge amount of money and time and effort with job creation schemes. So infamously, the autobahns there, the photo there of Hitler driving on the first autobahn. It's a huge amount of expense to build motorways. A lot of public buildings, swimming pools, town halls, all that kind of stuff, sports facilities. So they've spent a huge amount of time and money building these things, and people generally were proud of these new investments. Another big area was rearmament. Obviously, the Nazis, I should say, were kind of planning ahead and realised that if they were going to get Lebensraum, living space, they would have to fight more wars. So they dramatically increased military spending, and they began developing new tanks and aircraft. And obviously, these are very complicated machinery that take a huge amount of research and employment. They also reduced unemployment by something called invisible employment, i.e., let's just fiddle the figures. Okay, so they took Jews off. Jews don't count; they're not people. Women don't count, okay, because they should be at home with the kids. They also, because men were the RAD, they weren't included because they were publicly helping, and the increasing huge numbers of people in concentration camps didn't also count on the figure. So while unemployment did reduce by these huge job creation schemes, a lot of it was down to the basically Nazis just fiddling the figures. Okay, the standard of living. So one of the things that the Nazis did do was they established something called the German Labour Front, the DAF, which replaced trade unions. So they had a series of programs, the KDF, which is Strength Through Joy, and then the main role of that was to make workers happier. And this was incredibly popular and successful. So, they'd have low cost or free activities, sports activities, or often free holidays that, you'd sign up through with really, really cheap holidays. Also, something called the beauty of labour. So the idea that your place of work would be, have a nice cafe, good facilities, and improve your conditions in the workplace. This wasn't particularly popular because people kind of felt forced to do this in their own time and build it in their own time. The most famous example of, working was the Volkswagen, and they designed the VW Beetle as an incentive. People kind of paid into a fund to kind of get one of these cars. It was all a bit of an illusion, but people felt proud to be working. So what did improve was that there was more jobs. You can't dispute that. Wages did increase by about 20%, which is a huge amount. The KDF, the Strength Through Joy, was really popular and did provide leisure activities. And car ownership did increase by 3 times. On the downside, a lot of this was a myth. The fiddling the figures with the invisible unemployment. So while wages did increase, the cost of food increased. This was kind of equaled out by that negated, it's called. So actually people didn't really have much more money. It was just, they just had more money, but they couldn't buy more stuff. The biggest problem was they ended up, because they weren't trade unions, they ended up working much longer hours. Okay, so I think it was about 4 or 5 more hours a week, and really only the rich could afford cars. Okay, the last area and topic to do is about minorities, and I've really tried to summarize this as much as possible. So, oh my word. So, first of all, racial beliefs and policies. So obviously the Nazis believed in what was known as a racial hierarchy. With themselves at the top of the triangle, they're the Aryans, the master race, and then right at the bottom you'd have the Jews and everybody else. They also established race farms, where members of the SS would actually, believe it or not, meet other Aryan women and have other Aryan children, which is all a bit weird. The German word for what they called Untermenschen, which means subhuman, so people who weren't worthy of being humans, were Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs, and they began to be treated horrendously. So the Nuremberg laws, which I'll talk about in more detail, created a whole series of laws. For example, they had to wear the Star of David. They were started to get sent, like Gypsies, for example, were rounded up and arrested and sent to concentration camps and banned from travelling. People were sterilised, like homosexuals were sterilised and not allowed to have children. Other groups, like mentally handicapped or disabled people, were also sterilised and often killed. Okay, so vagrants, homeless people. So this was a real, belief system that many people in Germany believed. So in terms of just purely persecuting Jews, so first of all, Jewish people, where did this all come from? Well, there's been, it isn't just Germany that's persecuted Jews. There's been a long history of this. Karl Marx, for example, the founder of communism, was Jewish. Jews have been blamed for the defeat of the First World War. So lots and lots of things that kind of led to kind of a lot of unhappiness with Jews in Germany. So in terms of businesses, people began to boycott and stop shopping at Jewish shops. Then shops were vandalised and set on fire. And eventually, by 1939, Jews were banned from owning businesses. In professions like lawyers, teachers, they were sacked. Importantly, somebody died, you couldn't inherit their land, so Jews couldn't pass their money or property on to their relatives, and Jews were banned from public places, parks, swimming pools, all those kind of things. Two of the most infamous things that happened was in 1935, the government passed a series of laws, which was hundreds of laws, loads of Jews can't use public telephones and all kinds of things. But, the most infamous three was Jews were no longer citizens. They literally were not citizens of Germany. They could not marry or have sexual relationships with Germans, and they were forced to wear the yellow star. So, this was official discrimination by the government that was allowed legally. The last event was called Kristallnacht in 1938, and long story here. Basically, a Jewish person, not communist, a Jewish person in Paris went up and shot a German, and this kick-started a whole series of attacks on homes, businesses, and synagogues. Hundreds of people killed. Over nearly 200 synagogues were destroyed. And believe it or not, the Jews were actually blamed for starting the attacks. They were actually fined 1 billion marks to pay for the damage that somebody else had caused on their property, which is very bizarre. So, all in all, this is all central to this Aryan belief. So that's it. That's the end. I may do, if I find time, do some kind of more specific exam-based clips. Thanks for listening.